They called it Rosie, a place where the city's forgotten women vanish behind concrete walls, only to be remembered when their names appear in the news or on a headstone. Inside Rikers Island's Rose M. Singer Center, thousands of women wait for trial, for sentences, for a chance to start over. Some wait for years. Others never make it out. There are stories that the city refuses to tell, of mothers giving birth in handcuffs, of guards who blur the line between protector and predator, of mental illness ignored until it explodes. And in the middle of it all, a system designed to forget them. Tonight, we remember. This is the Forgotten Inmates, Women at Rikers. Before we begin this story, take a moment to support what we do. Every like, every share, and every subscription helps us bring these hidden stories to light, the ones that the world too often tries to forget. So, if you believe the truth should never stay locked behind bars, hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share this video so more people can hear their voices. Now, let's step inside. The island within the island. If you've ever flown into New York City, you might have seen it without realizing. A small, gray island sitting quietly in the East River, connected to Queens by a single bridge. That's Rikers Island, one of the most infamous jail complexes in the world. But on the far end of that island, separated by razor wire and silence, lies something even more hidden. They call it Rosie. The Rose M. Singer Center, named after a reform advocate, built with the promise of rehabilitation and dignity. But over the years, that promise has rotted away, brick by brick, until all that's left are whispers and ghosts. Inside, women sit in cold dorms, mothers, daughters, teenagers. Many are there for misdemeanors. Some haven't even been convicted. Yet they sleep on metal bunks behind locked gates, under the same sky that billions of dollars in Manhattan light up every night. Rikers wasn't meant to be forever. It was supposed to be temporary, a holding place. But for thousands of women, it became a world they couldn't escape. Inmates here tell stories of nights when the heat fails and the cold feels alive, of days when correction officers punish you not with fists, but with time. Time in solitary, time without visitation, time without being believed. In 1988, when the Rose M. Singer Center first opened, it was hailed as a victory for progressive justice. A women's facility that would offer prenatal care, therapy, education, a place to help rebuild lives. But the moment the gates clanged shut, reality took over. Funding was stripped, cells overcrowded, and the programs meant to uplift women disappeared one by one. By the mid-2000s, Rosie had become a holding cell for despair, where over 70% of inmates were mothers, many separated from their children for years. One former inmate said, "The worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was watching birthdays pass. Watching your child grow up in pictures while you sat in a cell." And yet, what makes Rosie different from the rest of Rikers is what it represents. It's a mirror of society's quiet cruelty toward women who fall through the cracks. Women who are poor. Women who are Black, Latina, or mentally ill. Women who were victims long before they were ever labeled criminals. In the early 1990s, over 1,000 women were held here at once. Some arrived pregnant. Some gave birth inside. And some never saw their newborns again. A journalist once wrote that the nursery wing, the only one of its kind in New York City, felt like a hospital trapped in a prison. Cribs behind bars. Guards standing over bassinets. A lullaby of keys and chains. The women called it the cradle and the cage, because no matter how much they loved those babies, every mother knew that once her sentence ended, the world outside would never be the same. But this story isn't just about motherhood. It's about power, control, and the quiet, suffocating ways the system breaks people, especially women, who dare to fight back. Over the decades, Rikers Island has seen riots, lawsuits, and scandals that made national headlines. But almost every one of them focused on the men. The men's jails, the men's deaths, the men's gangs. The women, they disappeared in the margins. Until one case, one tragedy, forced New York to pay attention again. Her name was Layleen Polanco. She was 27 years old, a transgender woman of color, locked inside solitary confinement in 2019, and she never made it out alive. Her story would ignite outrage across the city, spark protests, and reopen old wounds about how Rikers treats its most vulnerable. But Layleen's death wasn't the beginning. It was a symptom of decades of neglect, violence, and dehumanization inside the walls of the Rose M. Singer Center. And if you listen closely, you can still hear their stories echo between those walls. Over the next hour, we'll go inside Rikers through testimonies, reports, and hidden accounts to uncover the truth about Rosie. We'll meet the women who were silenced, the officers who lost control, and the advocates fighting to shut it down for good. Because what happens on that island says everything about the world beyond it, the forgotten mothers. There's a sound you hear every night in the Rose M. Singer Center. It isn't the buzz of the lights or the clang of the gates. It's the sound of women whispering their children's names into the dark, over and over, until they fall asleep. Some whisper to remember. Some whisper not to forget. Inside Rikers, motherhood becomes a memory. Letters take weeks to arrive. Phone calls cost more than food, and visits, when they happen, are filtered through glass thick enough to feel like an ocean. One woman, Maritza, 29, arrested for a parole violation, said she hadn't touched her son in 2 years. Her voice cracked when she spoke to a journalist. "He still calls me Mommy," she said, "but I think he forgets what my face looks like." Over 70% of the women held at Rosie are mothers. Many are the only caregivers their children have. Yet, when they're booked into Rikers, motherhood doesn't matter. The system takes your fingerprints, your belongings, and then your name. You stop being mom. You become an 8-digit number. Some mothers give birth inside. Others come in already carrying life and leave carrying loss. In the early 2000s, Rikers had a nursery program, a wing where mothers could stay with their newborn for up to a year. It was supposed to be a symbol of compassion. But even that was built on a contradiction, a crib in a cage. Officers called it the quiet ward, but the women called it something else. The place where you love with handcuffs on. Imagine giving birth chained to a hospital bed. Imagine holding your newborn for just a few minutes before an officer says, "Time's up." For decades, that was a reality at Rikers. Even after court rulings declared the practice unconstitutional, it didn't disappear. It just became less visible. One nurse who worked there for 15 years described it in a letter. "We used to untie the women for labor, but as soon as the baby came, the cuffs went back on. It wasn't about safety. It was about power." Outside, New York never sleeps. But inside, time slows until it feels like punishment itself. Mothers count the days by their children's birthdays. One inmate marks each year by a new drawing her daughter sends. Flowers drawn in crayon, hearts around the word mommy. She says when she's finally released, she'll have 6 drawings, 6 years lost to the island. For many women, jail isn't the start of their story. It's the continuation of a life already steeped in trauma. More than 80% of women in Rikers report surviving physical or sexual abuse before their arrest. Most grew up in poverty. Many were victims before the world ever labeled them criminals. One former inmate named Renee, 34, said, "They talk about rehabilitation. But how do you heal in the same kind of place that broke you?" In Rikers, motherhood doesn't soften your sentence. It amplifies your pain. Officers sometimes call the women crybabies. When an inmate breaks down after a phone call, she's told to toughen up. When she writes letters too often, mail mysteriously goes missing. Even the smallest act of comfort, a shared photo, a hug, becomes contraband. I used to press my ear to the wall just to feel something. You hear other women crying, laughing, praying, and you realize that's all we got left, sound. Sound is freedom here. Freedom, the word they all use but none can touch. Once a month, buses line up outside Rosie, filled with children visiting their mothers. For many kids, Rikers is their first memory of their parent. Metal detectors, pat-downs, cold rooms. They learn early that love sometimes wears a uniform. A counselor who worked there for 10 years said, "You see the same faces come back, not because they're criminals, but because the system gives them nowhere else to go. They lose jobs, homes, kids. Rikers becomes the only constant." She paused before adding, "These women aren't dangerous. They're discarded. 85% of the women here haven't even been sentenced. They're legally innocent, but too poor to pay bail. Some sit for months, others for years. And when they finally get to court, their children barely recognize them. One public defender said, "We don't call it pretrial detention anymore. We call it pretrial destruction, because by the time freedom comes, the damage is already done." Rikers was built to hold the guilty and the waiting. But for mothers, it holds something else entirely, the constant ache of being unseen. Every woman at Rikers has a story, some of survival, some of regret, but most of love that refuses to die, even in the darkest corners of the island. Because no matter how loud the gates slam shut, a mother's whisper always finds a way to echo back. The officers in the silence. In every prison, there's a line. It's invisible, but everyone knows it's there. On one side, the inmates. On the other, the officers. And between them, a silence so thick, it feels alive. At Rikers Island, that silence is everything. It's the air people breathe, the shield they hide behind, and the weapon used when words to destroy careers. The Rosie. Singer Center was meant to be different. A progressive facility. Staffed with more female correctional officers than any other jail in the city. The theory was simple. Women guarding women would mean empathy, restraint, understanding. But Rikers has a way of changing people. Officers here work 12-hour shifts. They see violence, breakdowns, desperation, every single day. Over time, the job becomes a mask. Compassion turns into armor, and silence becomes survival. One former officer described it like this. At first you try to help. Then you realize help gets you punished. So you stop. She said when she once reported a fellow guard for striking an inmate, she was transferred to night shift the next week, isolated, ignored, frozen out. At Rikers, they call it the blue wall. The blue wall is more than loyalty. It's a code. You protect your own, or you become the next target. Over the years, dozens of reports from inside Rosie have detailed physical assaults, retaliation, and even sexual misconduct between staff and inmates. But most of it never leave the island. Because when silence becomes policy, truth becomes contraband. One 2020 investigation found that at least 40% of all sexual abuse complaints at Rikers came from the Rosie Singer Center. But almost none led to charges. Many of the accused officers still work there, promoted, even commended. When the guards hold the keys, justice never stands a chance. Not all guards were cruel. Some tried to change things. Small acts of defiance, quiet moments of humanity. There was Officer Diaz, who used to sneak extra tampons to inmates when supplies ran out. Officer Coleman, who smuggled a Bible into solitary for a woman on suicide watch. And Sergeant Green, who paid out of pocket for a new crib in the nursery wing. They did what they could. But kindness, in a place like Rikers, comes at a cost. In 2016, a report leaked from inside Rosie. Pages of handwritten notes by an anonymous officer. The document described a culture of intimidation, where female inmates were routinely strip-searched without cause, and officers traded favors for silence. One line read, "We are told not to see too much. The less we know, the longer we last." That same year, several officers were charged with misconduct. None were convicted. And for the women left behind, the message was clear. Rikers protects its own, no matter who gets hurt. But the silence doesn't only destroy the inmates. It consumes the officers too. Many leave the job haunted by what they've seen. Others can't leave at all. Depression, PTSD, and suicide rates among Rikers staff are among the highest in the country. One female officer wrote in her resignation letter, "Every night, I hear the gates closing in my sleep. I wake up and still feel trapped. The island doesn't just hold inmates. It holds everyone who steps onto it. Every guard, every nurse, every administrator, all part of a system too big to fix, too corrupt to escape. Yet amid that silence, there are cracks. And through those cracks, truth sometimes escapes." In 2018, a female officer named Angela Rivers spoke publicly about conditions inside Rosie. She described overcrowded dorms, broken showers, and nights when medical help never came. When her story aired, she was suspended for violating internal policy. Her last words in that interview were, "If they silence the officers, imagine what they do to the women." At Rikers, silence has always been currency. It buys loyalty, it buys safety, and it buries truth. When a place is built on silence, even the innocent start to whisper. Everyone learns to survive the same way, by pretending not to see. But every once in a while, someone speaks, and when they do, their words echo far beyond the island's walls. Those echoes reached City Hall, sparked investigations, and fueled the growing movement to shut Rikers down forever. But while politicians debated and committees held hearings, women kept dying. One of them, a name that became a symbol, was Layleen Polanco. She wasn't just another inmate. She was a daughter, a dancer, a sister, a friend, and her death would expose the full, brutal weight of Rikers' silence. The death of Layleen. Her name was Layleen Polanco Stravaganza. To the world outside, she was a performer, a dancer, a dreamer, a proud Afro-Latina transgender woman. To Rikers Island, she was inmate number 241-19-06311. And on June 7, 2019, her heartbeat stopped. Layleen's story didn't begin at Rikers. It began in the Bronx, where she was known for her radiant smile and her presence in New York's ballroom scene. She was part of the legendary House of Stravaganza, a community that gave life and belonging to people who had nowhere else to go. She was 27 years old. She loved music, eyeliner, and laughter that filled a room. But like too many women of color living on the margins, she also carried struggle with money, with mental health, with a city that rarely shows mercy. In April 2019, she was arrested on a misdemeanor, a minor charge, tied to an old sex work case and a missed court date. Her bail? $500. An amount so small, it almost sounds unreal. But to Layleen, it might as well have been a mountain. She couldn't afford it. So she was sent to Rikers Island, to the Rose M. Singer Center, to wait. Wait for court. Wait for help. Wait for freedom. She never got any of them. Layleen had epilepsy. Her family told the city repeatedly that she suffered from seizures. Records show that officers and medical staff knew about her condition. Still, after a few weeks in general population, she was sent to punitive segregation, solitary confinement, for a minor disciplinary infraction, a small argument, a punishment that would last 2 weeks. She wouldn't survive 10 days. On June 7th, officers making their rounds noticed Layleen lying still on her bunk. Her cell light was dim, her breathing silent. For nearly 45 minutes, no one checked on her. When they finally opened the door, she was already gone. The official report listed epileptic seizure as the cause of death. But when the surveillance footage was released, the truth was far worse. The video showed officers laughing outside her cell. They knocked on the door once, twice, then walked away. They returned several times, not to help but to joke. When they finally entered, one officer said, "She's probably faking." Layleen had been dead for hours. Her death was not an accident. It was neglect. Neglect wrapped in bureaucracy, sealed behind policies and protected by silence. The city erupted. Protesters filled the streets, from the Bronx to Brooklyn, chanting her name. They held signs that read, "No more deaths at Rikers." Her sisters from the House of Stravaganza danced in the rain outside City Hall, their heels pounding the pavement like drums of resistance. And for the first time in years, the world listened. Layleen became more than a victim. She became a symbol of everything wrong with the system and everyone it failed. Her mother, Maria Polanco, stood in front of reporters, voice shaking but unbroken. "My daughter didn't deserve to die alone. She was sick. They knew it, and they left her there." The Department of Correction promised an internal review, a familiar phrase, the kind that sounds like action but usually ends in dust. Months later, the results were released. No criminal charges, no terminations, just suspensions and more silence. Layleen's family received a $5.9 million settlement from the city, one of the largest ever related to a death at Rikers. But no amount of money could answer the question her case left behind. How many more? After her death, activists and journalists began digging deeper. They found that solitary confinement, long condemned as psychological torture, was still being used on women with mental health conditions. Despite policies banning it, the practice continued, often under new names: punitive housing, restrictive units. Different words. Same cruelty. In solitary, time doesn't move the way it should. A day can feel like a week can feel like a year. And for someone like Layleen, already vulnerable, already sick, it became a death sentence delivered in silence. When her story reached the national stage, it sparked something Rikers hadn't seen in decades: accountability. Advocates pushed for the end of solitary confinement for women. Lawmakers called for Rikers to finally be shut down. The mayor promised a new system of justice. But for many on the island, promises mean nothing. They've heard it all before. Layleen's story wasn't the first tragedy at Rikers, and it wouldn't be the last. Over the next few years, other names joined hers. Women found dead in cells, reports buried, cases dismissed. Each one whispered the same question into the city's conscience: how many people have to die before an island can rest? Every year, the tide rises around Rikers Island, the water slowly swallowing its edges, as if the city itself is trying to erase it. But stories like Layleen's won't drown. They surface, again and again, because truth has a way of floating back to light. Layleen's friends still gather in her honor each June. They wear gold. They dance. They speak her name out loud, not as an inmate, but as a woman who deserved better. And in that rhythm, in the echo of her laughter, you can still hear her defiance. Because even in death, she refuses to be forgotten. Dedicated to Layleen Polanco and every woman silenced by Rikers Island, the invisible illness. They call it the Island of the Forgotten. But inside the Rose M. Singer Center, there's another name whispered among the inmates. They call it the Island of the Broken, because behind every locked door, every quiet stare, there's a story of pain that medicine never touched, pain that prison made worse. More than 60% of women at Rikers suffer from mental illness: depression, PTSD, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. But here, those words don't bring treatment. They bring isolation. Inside Rikers, mental illness isn't seen as something to heal. It's seen as something to control. On paper, Rikers is a mental health unit, a place designed for therapy and rehabilitation. In reality, it's just another wing of punishment. Cells with no windows, lights that never dim, guards who double as counselors. The difference between the psychiatric unit and solitary confinement is often just a sign on the door. A former mental health nurse described it this way: we didn't have the resources to treat anyone. We just tried to keep them alive. She said the medication line stretched down the hall. Dozens of women waiting each morning for small plastic cups of pills they didn't always understand. Sometimes the wrong pills. Sometimes too much. Sometimes nothing at all. One woman, Kiana, said she went a week without her antidepressants. She filed complaints, begged the guards, even wrote a letter to medical staff. By the time she got her medication back, she'd already tried to take her life. Her roommate found her before the officers did. But instead of getting therapy or care, Kiana was punished, placed in restrictive housing. For her safety, they said. But in Rikers, for your safety usually means alone. Isolation is supposed to be temporary. But for women struggling with mental illness, it becomes endless. Days blur into nights. The only sound is the buzz of the light. You start to talk to the walls because they're the only things that answer back. A former inmate said, the silence starts to crawl into your head. It eats your thoughts. You forget who you are. Between 2015 and 2023, more than 24 women at Rikers attempted suicide. At least 5 succeeded. Most had histories of mental illness. All were labeled stable by staff the day before they died. Internal reports later revealed that staff shortages, missed rounds, and falsified welfare checks were common. Sometimes guards wrote down that they'd check cells every 15 minutes, when surveillance footage showed they hadn't been there for hours. One whistleblower described it as a system built on paperwork, not people. Inside Rikers, prayer becomes therapy, laughter becomes rebellion, and hope becomes the most dangerous thing to hold on to. Some nights, women press their faces to the tiny windows and look out toward the water, the same water that separates them from the city skyline. They say it feels like the city is taunting them. Close enough to see, but too far to reach. One said, "I can see the lights of Queens from my window. I tell myself my daughter's under one of those lights. That's how I keep breathing." Mental illness doesn't start at Rikers. It starts long before, in trauma, abuse, poverty. But once inside, it's treated as weakness. And weakness, on the island, is blood in the water. Some guards use that vulnerability as control. A cruel joke here, a taunting remark there. One inmate described it as psychological warfare. They break you without touching you. They don't have to hit you, she said. They just remind you no one cares if you live or die. Inmates who act out from stress or anxiety are often placed in isolation or sprayed with pepper spray instead of receiving treatment. One internal audit found that mental health calls were often ignored for hours because staff were shorthanded. Others were dismissed entirely as behavioral manipulation. But the truth is simple. Rikers doesn't rehabilitate mental illness. It manufactures it. Yet, even here, some find ways to survive. There are small circles of resilience. Women who read to each other at night, who hum gospel songs to the walls, who tear scraps of notebook paper into folded hearts and pass them under doors. They call themselves the light keepers, because when the guards shut off the lamps, they whisper stories of the outside, of freedom, of faces they'll one day see again. For a few moments, the island disappears. Those small acts of connection, a shared song, a whispered prayer, become the medicine Rikers refuses to give, because in a place built to crush the human spirit, empathy becomes rebellion, but no rebellion lasts forever. Each year, the Department of Correction announces new mental health reforms, new plans, new training, new oversight committees. And each year, the same cycle continues. Budget cuts, staff shortages, neglect, the numbers change. The pain doesn't. We treat people as if they're disposable. We call it justice. But it's not justice when we punish people for being sick. Those were the words of Dr. Lisa Mendez, a former Rikers psychiatrist who resigned after witnessing what she called institutionalized cruelty. She described being told to just stabilize them until sentencing. Translation: keep them alive until the paperwork clears. One of her patients, a 23-year-old woman named Tanya, was found hanging in her cell in 2021. She had written a letter the night before that ended with a single line: "I just wanted someone to listen." But in Rikers, listening is a privilege no one can afford. The human mind wasn't meant to live behind metal and noise. And yet, for decades, Rikers has forced thousands of women to do just that, to battle their own thoughts in a place that thrives on breaking them. Some leave with scars you can't see. Some never leave at all. Mental illness at Rikers is the island's quietest tragedy, one that doesn't make headlines, one that doesn't riot. It simply endures. Unseen, unheard, invisible, because the walls here don't just hold bodies. They hold minds. And the longer you stay, the harder it is to remember which side of the bars you're really on. Rikers Island was never supposed to last this long. It was meant to be temporary, a stopgap, but for too many women, it became a lifetime, a cycle of poverty, silence, and pain hidden behind the skyline of New York City. If these stories moved you, don't let them fade away like the voices Rikers tried to erase. Help us keep their stories alive. Hit like if you believe these women deserve to be heard. Share this video so the world never forgets them. And subscribe to our channel to stand with every voice that still echoes behind the walls. Because as long as their stories live, they are not forgotten.